Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 13th of October, and today we're looking at important updates beginning with Velyka Novosilka, then Vuhledar, Tsukuryne on the Pokrovsk front, and then looking northwards at Kharkiv and Kursk, of course, to end off the video. I want to begin by entertaining the possibility of the Russians capturing the village of Levadne. This was reported today by Russian sources, including Rybar, although there was no confirmation from the Russian MOD itself, for instance, or Ukrainian side or footage, anything of that sort. The claim being made is that the 336th Naval Infantry Brigade was involved in that attack. And this is a really interesting development if it were to be true. Also, you had the Ukrainian General Staff reporting on 10 Russian land-based assaults with air support coming in on the entirety of the Velyka Novosilka axis, spanning from Levadne all the way to Zolota Niva. So really wide extent of attacks, both from air but also artillery and ground-based forces. And when you look at it, the Ukrainians, they've been present here ever since the beginning of the counteroffensive, when they took back a lot of these territories that are either south of the border between Dnipro and Zaporozhye or south of Velyka Novosilka itself. Levadne is important from a topographical perspective when you look at it, because the nexus of the fighting in this region has largely been around the Mokry River Valley. That is a low elevated region. You could see it marked with this light green color. It's split between Russian and Ukrainian control, and a lot of the back and forth has been solely focused on capturing villages that are adjacent to that river valley. Then you look at the areas east and west of it, whether they're under Russian or Ukrainian control. Most of them are under Russian control, but regardless, usually those banks are on heights that overlook the river valleys. And so you have that, for instance, to the east and also to the west. To the west, you have this sort of diagonal shape that the ridge takes, and it runs through Ramivka, Pryutny, and also Levadne. And it runs all the way to where you see the trenches marked over here, these really dense trenches in light yellow. And so here's the X showing where the heights are located, mainly under Russian control, but some of it also extends northwestwards into Ukrainian holdings. What they don't have as highly elevated area, the Ukrainians, would be villages like Olhivske, Poltavka, and then some of the larger rear concentrations that are several kilometers away from the border, like Uspanivka. You can see over here is probably like 15 kilometers away. Russian forward artillery groupings that are located on some of these hills near Pryutny, they do have the ability to fire towards there. And it is important to fire there because it essentially acts as a conduit between the larger Ukrainian support force in Dnipro, which comes in from the city itself, but also from Pavlohrad, and then crosses past the various highways and the layers of trenches to make it all the way to the intermediary line in an area like Uspanivska. And from there, you actually have the dispersion to the front line. And so this is a really important intermediary target for the Russian forces. You have a road junction over here. This is one of the few areas in the region where they actually have paved routes, and they're protected by trenches for that reason. And so you have this sort of security buffer created by the Ukrainians of 10 kilometers, and that includes an area like Levadne, which serves as a local heights to help, prevent any sort of flanking attacks onto an area like Olhivska, for instance. And so that would be the significance of losing it. There's also reports of attacks towards Novodarivka, but none of that is confirmed as of now. More generally, it's interesting to note that this triad between Donetsk, Dnipro, and Zaporozhye oblasts, it's not that well developed. Not a lot of paved routes, especially in the Russian side, but also over here in the western part of this square. That's probably due to some of the rugged terrain, but also just due to the villages here being rural in nature. So there's less of a need for a huge amount of routes. And so then the Ukrainians need to really utilize whatever they do still maintain under their control to the best of their ability. And then the open areas also present opportunities for large-scale armored assaults. Although for now, I do firmly believe that it is a secondary or tertiary objective for the Russian forces in this region. The battlefield can be prepared in a way that would make it conducive for future assault operations. An area where the attacks are more serious would be here just north of Vodiane. You can see a Russian advance amounting to 5.75 square kilometers. It is an important advance through an open field region 2 kilometers to the west. This is essentially a Russian flanking operation to clear out the Ukrainian holdings from whether it be 72nd Brigade or 61st Brigade or some air assault unit like the 79th. that are holding on to these trenches that were meant to defend against vertical assaults coming from the south. Now they're being flanked from the east as well. And so it's supposed to create pressure from several axes to force the Ukrainians out and coalesce around Velyka, which you can see is a really immediate Russian objective. At the same time, it also serves the purpose of further deepening Russia's very strong southern flank, overlooking the chain of villages that includes Kharkiv, but then also branches westwards along the paved routes to like Ilinka, for instance, or Romanivka. There's a whole host of villages here, but then all of them end up connecting to Uspanivka in the northwestern region. And so that is definitely also a part of Russia's planning over here. They are trying to strengthen their southern flank directly south of Kateryivka, as opposed to directly storming the village due to the track record of the 79th Air Assault Brigade conducting very fierce defensive activities in the houses nearby, like in Konstantinivka or in Novomikhailivka. And there are reports of some surrenders going on over here from one individual squad of the 79th Brigade, but it can't be verified as of yet that it actually occurred from this incident in this location and at this time. But regardless, you do see that the Russians are, shaping the geography, trying to get control over local heights marked in this X over here in order to use that as a strong southern flank on a hill that would be able to easily fire upon whatever pocket remains in the village itself. Now, looking south of Selydove, we have confirmation of the 114th Motor Rifle Brigade storming the western portion of Tsukuryne. You can see that based on this marker showing an advance of nearly 0.7 square kilometers. The geolocation indicates that there was infantry storming it, going from house to house all the way to the warehouses, and now nearly all of the village is under Russian control. I suppose you can say that these agricultural facilities are still a gray zone or may maintain Ukrainian presence. There are also some trenches nearby, including near some tree lines, so that is, of course, possible. Then the issue is that the Russian advance here is connected to the rail lines, and that provides the Russians with a very strong vector to advance, for instance, towards Kreminna Balka, both through the windbreaks directly, but also from the north through the area that they've just taken over today in the yellow polygon. And so Kreminna Balka is under threat, and by extension, an area like Novoselydivka would be, both from Kreminna Balka, but also through this paved route that comes in from eastern Tsukuryne and then goes into the eastern outskirts of Novoselydivka. And so you have this whole cluster of Ukrainian villages that, due to this Russian crossing of the rail line, are now going to be under immediate threat. So there's going to be a huge emphasis from the Ukrainian perspective of really trying to prevent a larger blossoming of the front line. I would assume that includes at least one battalion of the 25th Airborne Brigade, also artillery support from the 55th Artillery Brigade, some elements of National Guard units like 2nd Battalion with the 15th National Guard Brigade. You also have the 68th Jaeger Brigade generally operating here. And so you're going to see some forces probably that were defending near Hirnik that had the, goal of maintaining control over forward positions in that city moved away to really prevent any sort of massive breakthrough occurring around Tsukuryne. And long term, that would be understandable because eventually a blossoming from this village would directly put Hirnik and nearby villages in harm's way, because you'd have the ability to advance southwards through open areas, cut off any access the Ukrainians have to the rest of the rear in Donetsk Oblast, using the Vovch River to isolate the Ukrainian forces located in this salient that you see over here. That would be the massive fear, and that's why any sort of a Russian advance over here does have that threatening posture. And you can see the unit involved. It's a DPR unit, First Army Corps. They were involved in a lot of the village hopping that occurred throughout August, going from village to village. In September, they had a more low-key role in operations. I suppose they were involved, for instance, in Kharkivka and then Halisnikivka, but really to a lesser extent, a lot of other Russian forces in this region. They picked up the Mandal and continued advances into Ukrainsk, for instance, and then Zelena Pershe, south of Selydove, for instance. Now, after the unit has been given several weeks of recuperation, they're going to be reintroduced into the battles and will be involved in future storming operations. And they do have now really strong experience in that regard after what they did in the summer. And you also have the 112th Kiev Territorial Defense Brigade. I don't know why I have them marked here. That's a mistake. They should be located near the Kharkiv front. Now, moving on to the Kharkiv front, you can see a marginal Russian advance. In terms of the extent, it's relatively small. It's an advance of zero point 0.5 square kilometers along some of the tree lines leading directly into Kruchlyakivka to the south and then Kolesnikivka to the north. These villages really are connected by this one paved route, and then there's the rail line over here to the west. So those are the two routes that act as conduits between the northern and southern Oskil River bridgeheads, you can say. But now, due to how close the Russians are, if you're measuring it, they are, let's see, basically 1 or 2 kilometers away from the Oskil River itself. Any sort of large scale movement, even small scale movement of several soldiers, it could be seen and fired upon very, very quickly. There's a huge threat, and in that regard, has basically been severed. You don't see any sort of land based connection between these two fronts. And so, any sort of connection would be through conduits. You have to cross over the Oskil River, go all the way southwards to one of the other crossings, like around over here. There are not that many bridges. A lot of them have been targeted, but the point really is that there aren't that many bridges or pontoon bridges that can account for every single part of the really, really long Oskil River. And so, just by the nature of the Russians being so close to one choke point, it has caused the logistical situation to become more difficult. And it's really divided up the focus of the Russian forces. Now they can choose to opt for more pressure, for instance, on the Kupiansk region, on the city itself. There's also the option of pressing forward further southwards in these relatively large open areas, not that many villages or trenches for a large portion of these open fields until you really go 15 kilometers deep into some of the actual trench lines built by the Ukrainians that are definitely, you could see, present on the map. They're not built around that many settlements, but they do protect the perimeter of several settlements, and then they're layered until you reach an area like Borova, and then the entire perimeter over there is protected. So there really are a lot of possibilities due to this one choke point being discovered and being used to sever the connection between different parts that used to coordinate. And that all started off with Pishane, and now the Russian focus really will be on actually getting control over this paved road and taking over the nearby villages. Now, moving on to Kursk, there aren't that many updates over the past 24 hours. I wouldn't be that surprised if overnight there are additional pieces of footage or reporting from people on the ground that gives us a clarification of what's going on. But in terms of footage that was released, for instance, on October 13th, we had a video here of just a large compilation of FPV strikes onto a forested area just west of Kruglik. This is probably an area where you have Ukrainian soldiers and vehicles operating. It was released by the 204th Akhmat Regiment. Additionally, southeast of Kuranovo, we have additional confirmation of Russian vehicles active along the highway. This time based on a geolocation from October 13th. There was a Ukrainian tank ambush and it led to the destruction of one Russian tank, a BTR-80, and a VPK Ural armored vehicle. And that footage is, of course, available on my map. You can see that it basically is in sync with my previous marking of the front line. So I'm not really going to change anything, but it just lends further credence to the idea that Russian vehicles have been able to push deeper in this direction. And they're doing so along this axis that leads directly into Zeleny Shleich. And then it poses a question as to whether there even are Ukrainians left in the salient that I have marked here. I just don't have any proof that really goes against it. So I'm waiting for something to negate that. Same thing with Olgovka, for instance, where there was not that much information surrounding whether the Russians have been able to fully clear it out or if Ukrainians withdrew on their own. But based on a lot of the Russian reporting and their mapping of the situation, it appears that the front line has really shifted in its entirety. And that would really mean 5 to 6 kilometers at the greatest extent, while areas near Kremyannoy remain a gray zone. The Ukrainians continue to talk about attempts at stabilization, but they're not too specific about what that means. Really, that is an indication that over the past few days, the Russian forces definitely have been successful in their pushes, not just around Zeleny Shleich, as we said, but also southeast of Kuranovo. In regards to the furthest extent of the Russian advance along this salient east of Lyubimovka, we now have additional proof showing Russian capture of 2.8 or 2.9 square kilometers, which includes the hamlet Zeleny Shleich itself. It probably occurred around October 10th, actually, and that's because of the deep state's claim. They showed a footage of a still, and probably there will also be a video released where they say that the Russians, they captured 9 Ukrainian drone operators and executed them after they were taken POW And the photo itself was geolocated to this tree line over here. You can see it's next to a relatively fortified position. So you could imagine that there were drone operators here, and it's located on what was imagined to be the rear because, again, previously the Russians were, say, 7-8 kilometers away, and then slowly but surely the Russians advanced through Lyubimovka. They were also probably 14 kilometers away from them if you're looking at the Kharkiv perspective. And so the Ukrainians didn't really feel a sense of urgency that they were about to be overrun up until it actually happened with the Russian vehicles advancing along the highway. And so they were caught by surprise, those drone operators. And that based on that geolocation, you could get the idea that the Russians actually are out operating near this trench facility. Same thing with Novoivanovka. That area does continue to be a gray zone, at least in part in the western regions. Now, moving on, according to Ukrainian sources this past week, including reports from Deep State itself, the Ukrainian military is looking to create a new army corps. So if you guys are aware of the corps structure in Ukraine, it has the 9th, 10th, and 11th Army Corps. Now I have the page open for the 9th, so you can get an idea of the size, for instance, of a Ukrainian Army Corps, and then the composition of each one specifically. So I'll show the 10th and 11th afterwards. And then there are two other ones, one attached to the Marines, and that one, of course, has the Marine brigades and some drone units. Then there's also the air assault forces, and they have their own Army Corps, which is understandable to a certain extent given that they do have similar functions. Now, according to Deep State, and they do have certain issues with this Ukrainian policy of creating a fourth Army Corps, they're saying that, for instance, operational command centers, these designated regions that are, dividing up certain parts of the front line, and then each unit within the operational command node is subordinate to the orders of the larger command center. That sort of structure of Ukrainian military, it has its own infrastructure already, training centers, subordinate military bases, support bases. It is a very self-sufficient system which has a large amount of experienced human capital, officers, and a managerial class. And you simply can't say the same thing for a lot of these army corps that were created rather hastily and that were created later on. And as a result, did not have an experienced cast of officers, for instance. And so, of course, the individual brigades themselves, like the 47th Brigade or the 3rd Assault Brigade, they do have relatively strong structures. They are relatively well staffed, for instance. But in terms of the corps itself, you have to create new roles and new staffing opportunities, and by necessity, promote people that may not actually be deserving of that role. And it feels like something that is futile and unnecessary to Deep State, for instance. And so they were criticizing the decision, saying that, for instance, with the 9th Army Corps, it's the structure of the corps itself has been largely destroyed. That's not to say that the individual brigades here have been totally destroyed, but a lot of the actual personnel for the corps itself, for the umbrella of all these units, is largely ineffective, does not have its own self-sufficiency, it's not really connected. Each individual brigade here is not actually fighting in the same part of the front line. If you may recall, for instance, the 3rd Assault Brigade, they have their presence around the Luhansk region right now. 47th Brigade, there are at least 2 battalions operating in Kursk, 58th Motorized Brigade operating near Velyka Novosilka and west of Vuhledar. And then you have a few logistics units and reconnaissance regiments or battalions. And that's really about it. There's not enough connectivity. There's not really a reason even to have a unified structure for all of these units, giving them one-size-fits-all orders. Now here you can see the structure of the 10th Army Corps. You can see units like the 115th Mechanized Brigade and the 100th Mechanized Brigade. Sure, those ones do operate in closer proximity. 116th Brigade is more split off with a lot of its forces either in Kursk or in the Volchansk region. 33rd Mechanized Brigade operating, just north of the Vuhledar region, operating south of Kharkiv. And so, again, not that much connection. Some of these other units, they're still in Zaporozhye because they were never moved away. That's where the 10th Army Corps was initially created and meant to be utilized for. And ever since, it's not really had the same sort of offensive footing, so it doesn't make as much sense to group the same units together. So the next Ukrainian Army Corps is expected to have between 4 to 5 mechanized or infantry brigades, also reconnaissance regiment or battalion, or some sort of logistical force to supply. And you can see here, this is the 11th Army Corps, the smallest one by far. this time it actually makes a bit more sense because a lot of these units like the 60th, 61st, 63rd, they do have a presence together on, that Donetsk, Luhansk border region near the Oskil River. And so that is, again, a bit understandable. But again, it is a relatively small size and not what you'd imagine from an army corps compared to the other two. And really, just to finish off, I would be interested to see which units are included in the new Army Corps if it ends up being created. Because right now, you have the Ukrainians in the process of creating the 160 series of brigades because, they already went through the 150 series in their efforts of staffing units and recruiting people in the latter stages of 2023 and the beginning of 2024. So now they're beginning the rounds of mobilization for the 2024 sort of end of this year for those new brigades, 10 new brigades that are being created. And so I'll be interested to see if, those units are grouped together in that new Army Corps. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye.